Good morning. I feel like I'm teaching a women's class this morning. All the men stayed out in the lobby. You like that? Oh, in case you hadn't figured it out, Martha and Tom are out of town. They're decided to drive into the hurricane and then head over to Hilton Head. They didn't encounter anything. Everything was good for them, so they're on their vacation. So he asked me to fill in today. I think Mark is going to be doing it next week. And so we'll see how that transition goes from the two of us. I think one of the things, if I'm not mistaken, what Tom taught about last week had to do with I'll call it a trial. He's standing before his accusers. Is that correct? Okay. And so I want to back up just a little bit to kind of frame all this. This is all taking place in just a few hours. It's not drawn out over weeks like we're doing. We go back and we have the meal that they went to, the Lord's Supper, we call it today. And when they were there, a couple of things took place. One was he called out a betrayer, which would be Judas, and then he said some things to Peter. He actually quoted Zechariah, and he talked about the shepherd would be struck, and when he was, the sheep would scatter. Then he went into how they would all abandon him. What did Peter say at that point? Yeah, he was in there. He was going to go full force here and be the person that he is, Peter as he is. And then after that took place from about just before sunset until about 10 o'clock, roughly, something of that sort. And so they had this meal and were spending that time together. The Seder service is a long service anyway, or a long exercise that takes place. And then after the Seder, they then go out into the Garden of Gethsemane. And then Jesus prays, and he has James, John, and Peter going with him. How long did they pray? A long time. It's theorized it was probably about 2 hours. So probably from about somewhere from the 10 o'clock to the midnight hour that was to do what? And then he comes back and corrects them, and what do? And then he comes back again, talks to them, and tells them, stay awake, be alert and be prepared. He told them to pray because while the spirit was willing, the flesh was weak. And so we find this challenge that's taking place with them. And so that probably took place from maybe from 11 to 12, maybe from 12 to 1, somewhere in that period. So you get this long stretch of time. As soon as they're through praying, what takes place in the garden? The betrayal takes place, and the arrest that comes about. You've got Judas coming in to do the betrayal. Then you have the chief priests, and it is multiple there, which is we'll get into just a little bit. And then the elders and the scribes, and they arrest him. And what does Peter do in that moment? Do what? Oh. Is that where he takes out his sword and cuts the ear? Because I thought you said he did something with the door. I can't hear. Sword, took his sword out and cut the servant's ear off. And then Jesus restores that. And then what do the disciples do at that point as they're taking Jesus off? They scatter and run everywhere. And so at that point, all that Tom taught about last week would be taking place. And that would be going on from about 1 to 3 o'clock roughly. If I'm off by an hour, but that's taking place. all this, I want to say false accusations, but all that was taking place over here in the courtyard. Now, they were at the courtyard, which was a four-cornered structure. It was the home of Annas and Caiaphas. Now, they are related. You have Caiaphas. Okay, get it straight in your brain. I think Annas was the first chief priest. And if y'all heard this last week from Tom, you can correct me if I get it wrong. But they were established by the Romans. Now, if you go back to the tabernacle, who were the high priests? Aaron and his sons. Those were the high priests. By the time we get to the temple, we're now driven by tribes, and where do the high priests come from? They come from Levi, the tribe of Levi. By the time we get to this point, understand the Romans are appointing the high priest. So you can see the destruction of the Jewish belief system. It's crumbling. And that's why one of the reasons it's kind of hidden in the messages. When Jesus was in the temple and he was driving out and cleansing it of the business that was taking place, he was also condemning it because it was not what God had intended. It had already corrupted itself. So this is all taking place. Again, I hope I get this right. Caiaphas was the first one, and he is thrown out. Annas. Boy, I'm brain dead. But anyway, one is the son-in-law of the other. And the courtyard probably was about the size of this room. So they kind of give you an idea. And in one corner would be one house. The other houses over here, they were probably 2 to 3 stories tall. Back here, you probably had another storage, 2 or 3 story one. And this would be another building over here. Maybe it was another family member or whatever. It may be the public meeting room. And there might have been 3 to 5 steps going up to the first floor. And then you would have the other floors above it. They would have a porch on the very top. Now, since it's nighttime, they're not using the porch. They're using some part of the building inside. Typically, the first floor would be where the public meetings would take place. Second and third floor were for living. But it does in here talk about Peter being below, and we'll touch on that in a second. So it is at least the steps coming down, or it may have been that the meeting took place in one of the upper rooms. But you have Jesus up there being accused of all that they have brought before him. They go back and forth from one house to the other house. The Sanhedrin get involved. It's a long, drawn-out process. Hopefully you covered all that last week. And so that's taking place 1 to 3 o'clock. During that same time, we're going to move our focus away from Jesus and look at Peter. And Peter, we'll pick it up at this point, and we'll be looking at chapter 14, and we're just going to read it from 66, I say we, Jamie's going to read it from 66 to verse 72.
And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Nazarene." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about." And he went out onto the porch. And the maid saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." But again he was denying it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." And immediately a cock crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep.
Okay, so where is Peter? I kind of told you a second ago. He's in the courtyard. Where in that courtyard? In the middle? Could it be? We don't know.
He's around the fire.
Yeah, he's around a fire. We do know from another, I don't think I'm getting into anything that Jamie was going to be reading. Do I have you reading chapter 18 of John? If the answer is no, I'm good. No. Okay. Just didn't want to step on what you were going to be reading. We do know from John that when they got there, there was another person ahead of him, and it's recorded in John. Since he never says who it is, the presumption is it probably was John, and he knew the high priest. He gets Peter in the building. So apparently you got him past the bouncer, got him into the courtyard so that he could hear what was going on. I want to stop for a second and back up. Who did Peter and John think Jesus was? Not a trick question. The Son of God, the Messiah, and Scripture had given them plenty of prophecy about who the Messiah would be, what role he would have. What was his role to be? King. He was not, there is prophecy about him being a suffering servant, but I think I said the last time I taught, there are at least 3 verses or 3 references for him being king and ruler and judge over the world, for every one about him coming as a suffering servant. So they would have looked to him being a king and established his kingdom here. All of a sudden, their king has been arrested, going through this interrogation, and so what is Peter's mind frame? What is he thinking? What would you be thinking in that situation? What is going on? It's not lining up the way you think it's supposed to line up. This is not working out. I thought it was a great point. I mean, you think about it. They cut up the servant's ear off, and Jesus reached up and put it back on. You think that would kind of make an impression on the people that were there, but it didn't. They were going to go forward with a crucifixion, and so they're pushing that way, and Peter is terribly confused. He does not know what's going on. He should, but at the same time, in that moment, he didn't. He probably was fearful because this is just not working out the way he had expected. Jill, I said something last time I was teaching. You asked a question about am I surprised that Jews do not think that Jesus is the Messiah? And again, my reference was, no, I'm not, because there are, again, about 3 verses or 3 references for him being a king, judge, and ruler, for every one of him being a suffering servant. And so they would have concentrated on that. Also, given the time, they were wanting to get out of the bondage of Rome. And so they're looking for this king. And so they're leaning in that direction. And this is not lining up, and he ends up getting killed. Now, Jews stop at that point. He was killed. So clearly, he was not the Messiah. Now, what I didn't say, everybody in this room, I think, was born after 1948 or thereabout. So we don't have the same reference as the past almost 2,000 years did. From 70 AD to 1948, there was no nation of Israel. And so for any Jew living during that time, thinking about prophecy and all that's taking place, it doesn't make sense. How can Israel be established? Yes? Well, it was, yes, under Truman. Truman was the one that kind of pushed for it. So you've got this period that the Jews don't have any reference. How can you have a Christ who has come, a Messiah who has come, and yet at the same time there is no Israel to restore? And so there is nothing there for them to grab a hold of. Now, from 1948 to today, and we look at all the prophecies that are being fulfilled, it is hard to imagine why any thinking person, Gentile or Jew, doesn't look at Christ and go, this story is ringing true. I mean, there are things happening today that make this even more true than it was last week. So I don't know why today. So I guess I need to complete that thought. Today you do see a growing number of Jews coming to accept Christ and understanding first and second coming. But at that time they didn't, and certainly at the time of Christ, he is not coming out as the king of Israel. And so therefore, they don't have anything to do with him. He's just causing trouble in their structure. And so he was following them at a distance. I think in the lesson last week you had, it said Jesus followed him halfway. I don't know what that means exactly. Did Tom explain that? Okay, so that's what I get for not being here, but I didn't know what he was going to do. He definitely lagged behind. And as we said, John got him in. And so when he got there, he's confused. It must be cold. He's sitting over by the fire. What could he be doing besides warming up? Yeah, listening to what's going on. What is taking place? Now, they don't have windows and screens and shutters like we do today. It's an open window. And so they can see and possibly catch some things being said, probably not everything, but some things. And he's in the fire. Reason I kind of laughed about the fire being in the middle, I kind of think it might have been over close to the window where this is all taking place, because that's where Peter would have gone, not only to warm up, but to try to overhear what was taking place. And so that's going on, and he's sitting out there listening. What happens at that point while he's in the courtyard? Somebody approached him. Yeah, it was a maid, a servant, that said that. You know, she recognized him. She had seen him either at the temple or somewhere with a group, and said, you know, aren't you with him? What was Jesus' response? Peter's response.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I think it's hard for anybody to imagine. Now, I don't know how popular courtyards were. They might have been the nightclub of that time. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, I can't imagine a whole bunch of people being outside in the courtyard unless they were drawn to what was taking place. They probably knew that this was going on. Could be wrong, but I think they were there for that reason. And Peter denied him. He said, no, not going to happen. It's kind of hard to believe that Peter would do that in light of the fact that, number one, Jesus told him he would do it. And then secondly, while they were praying, he told him to pray because your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. And apparently he didn't do that. He slept instead. And so now this is taking place. What's interesting is it doesn't even seem that it registered with him what he just did. He was just trying to separate himself from the events that were taking place. I don't know that he'd given any thought to this. I think this is one of those things that just off the cuff, I'm listening, shut up, I want to hear what's going on. And yeah, and I think that was his response. What takes place next? Now, these buildings I said were connected by kind of a covered porch area so people could walk back and forth between those. And so I think at this point, that's what Peter goes. He goes to one of those porches. And when he gets there, what happens now? Okay, rooster crowed. First rooster crow. And apparently still not sinking in with Peter. This is where I identify with Peter a lot. I'm pretty dense. But he's over there, and the rooster crows, and then what takes place? Yeah, and in Matthew and Luke, it says one says there's a man, one says there's a woman. So apparently, this servant girl is still accusing him. She's followed him over there, accusing him, and others are now crowding in and going, hey, yeah, you were with him. We've seen you before with Jesus. Now, at this point, he's not caught off guard. He's now being defensive. What could he be afraid of? Suffering the same thing that Jesus is suffering. So he's got a natural human fear. Again, confused because this was to be the king of Israel, and here he is being manhandled by a bunch of religious leaders. And so he's having a real problem with taking place there. And his response this time? Same thing. No, I don't. Not me. Excuse me. I'm not used to these things. Okay, so he's caught off guard, but now he is moving from being off guard to being just defensive. And his denial now has a little more knowledge behind it. It's not just a reaction to somebody making an accusation. It is now an all-out, threat. What takes place the third time? Yeah, and I think it's in John. It'll be in one of the Gospels. Malchus was related to, this person was related to Malchus, who was the servant who had his ear cut off. And that person knew this was Peter. Probably knew not only that it was Peter that was there, but it was Peter that cut his ear off. And so he's able to identify him quickly. So all of a sudden, Peter has moved from this one maidservant to a maidservant and two others to now several people around him going, hey, no, we've got people that can identify you. They know who you are, and you're a Galilean. How many people have traveled to the Northeast or to the West Coast? Nobody? Well, if you do, they may notice something about the way you talk. And they're more than happy to point it out. Now, I've always thought the people that point it out, it's nothing like being in Boston and one of them come up to you and point out your accent, and you're looking at them going, we all have accents. But his accent was Galilean. He was not from this area where they were. He was from Galilee. And so they knew that he was with Jesus because there's no reason for him to be in this area otherwise. So he was called out by eyewitnesses, by one that knew that he had cut someone's ear off, by his accent. They probably could go down a list of other things. And Peter's caught. He is just now caught. So once he is caught and faced with the facts, Peter says what? Depending on the translation you're looking at, it either says he cursed or he cursed himself. And again, it will depend on the version you have. Most likely it is he cursed himself. He brought down divine judgment on himself for what he did. At this point, he no longer he's not caught off guard. He is not being defensive. He is now confessing that I am guilty of this and deserve judgment. And probably was more harsh on himself than even God was, but he was judging himself. One of the other Gospels also points out that says that Jesus looked at him. So I can't imagine what it would be like to see Jesus going through all this, but then about the time I denied him a third time, he turned and looked at me. How would you feel? And you can just run through a whole host of feelings that he had, and none of them are good. None of them are good. And so all this has taken place, and he is now facing an issue of learning from this event. Now, he doesn't learn from this event the next day. He learns from this event many years later. When we look at Peter in the writings he has later, we see a totally different personality. He has changed. And so let's look at 1 Peter, is it 3?
3.
Okay.
1 Peter 3, 14 through 16. But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame.
So what did Peter learn from those 3 denials that took place? He told him to always be ready to defend and do it in what kind of in personality, in what manner? In reverence, gentle. When I say reverent and gentle, Peter comes to mind, right? So you can see here what years of contemplation have done to this man. He is now understanding something that he didn't have even in his brain at the time of Christ walking on this earth. He was completely transformed. I've learned a lesson myself. Okay, so they've gone through these accusations. He is now I just can't quite get to where he is, but he is crushed with his third response. And then the rooster crows for the second time. It says at that point, he remembered about it. Let's look at a couple of, who has a New American Standard? Read the last part of verse 72. I'm sorry, Mark 14, verse 72.
Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep.
So he began to weep. Did it say anything about him hurrying? So in some it'll say he hurried away and wept. Anybody have the NIV? When he thought about it, in both that and the Christian Standard, Holman Christian Standard Version, it has the same thing. He gave thought to it. So one of them said he hurried away and wept. One said he broke down and wept. And then the other one you would see is that he gave thought to it. It depends on the version, and they're all interpreting the Greek to try to get across the idea of what he was saying. But the bottom line was, before he even got to the point of weeping, he was broken, he was crushed, he was hurrying away, and we don't know where he went. I mean, out of the courtyard? We just don't know. But at that point, he is ashamed. And if Jesus did look at him, I'm sure part of what he's doing is trying to get out of Jesus' sight because it is now extremely painful. Without confessing what, have any of you found yourself in a position where you were totally embarrassed by what you did and you had to confess it to Christ, but you really didn't want to spend much time there on it? You kind of like say, forgive me, and then get out of there. Why do we do that? Has anybody in this room ever been scolded by a parent? Did you go seek that scolding out? Did any of you ever hide hoping they wouldn't find you? shows how dumb we are. I mean, the parents going to find you, and they're going to scold you for, number one, doing whatever it was, and then two, for running off. So it's in our human nature not to want to be scolded, and yet that's where Peter felt he was. What can that type of sin do to your testimony? It damages it. You may even question whether you have a testimony to tell. You certainly don't want to go do this after confessing what your sins were. Very uncomfortable. And so, at this point, how good is Peter to what Christ wanted him to do? Do you think he's the leader of the disciples right now? I don't think he wanted to go do anything except get out of there. And so that's where we find Peter. Remember, we just read a few minutes ago about where he ended up. But now, why do you think he failed this miserably? He's human. Okay, we can identify with him now. He's human. What else? He was scared. He wasn't prayed up. I think he was confused. I mean, this is not panning out the way he thought it was going to pan out. And so you have all these emotions going through him that caused him to fail. Did he listen well? See, and most husbands in this room have identified with Peter. We can't help it. We just can't listen well. You can say something.
Well, I'm just thinking, yes, obviously Peter messed up royally, and I'm not trying to justify that, but where were the rest of the disciples? I mean, they were in hiding. So, he at least was present. He had some courage, not enough, but he had a measure of courage.
Yeah, and remember, John helped get him into the courtyard. So I don't know where John is in this time. He doesn't really tell us his part of it. I think he was even closer. But those two seem to have been the only two. The rest of them are no-shows. And they're in a boat, and there's a big storm, and Jesus walks up, and what does Peter do? He jumps out of the boat. This guy is very bold and ready to serve the Lord. He is, but he also, what happened when he got out on that water? And so I think we're at the same kind of event here. He was gung-ho. He was there. He was ready to support Jesus. But in the midst of that support, he took his eyes off Jesus. And when he did, he just sank. And here he has 3 denials of Christ sitting in front of him. He's a broken man and has no ministry. Right now, there are a lot of ministers that are being called out for sins. It seems like Texas area has been hit the hardest, but a lot of ministers dropping away. I'm not here defending them, but they are human. And the question we have to have sometimes is, do they have restoration and a role of leadership? And a lot of times, I'll confess it myself, I'm sitting there, no, they shouldn't be back behind the pulpit. Where does Peter end up?
He's the leader of the early church.
So God can restore. So anybody in here, I don't know what you've done wrong, but it wasn't bad enough. That's not an encouragement to go out and do something worse. That's an encouragement that you can be used by Christ. We can be used, and yet we so often give up, just like he did at that time. After that terrible night, we don't know where Peter ran off to, but we don't hear about him again until resurrection morning. It doesn't say that he was there at the cross. It just says it doesn't mention him. He could have been, we don't know. Not until the resurrection morning. The two Marys and Salome went to the grave to put the spices on him, and they encounter an angel. The angel tells them, go tell his disciples, go tell Jesus' disciples, and Peter. Now, when you read that, you have two ways of reading that. Jesus has disciples, then there's Peter. Or, go tell his disciples, especially Peter. Totally different readings in that message. Now, if you're Peter and you hear that Christ is alive, not at the grave, he told him to go to Galilee, and you hear, oh, and Peter. If you're Peter and you hear that, what are you thinking? Are you, yeah. Are you calling me out by name because I'm done something good? Or you calling me out because I have completely denied you? Peter's emotions are on a roller coaster. He does not know where he is through this entire event, and he is completely humbled and a broken man. He's being called out, and he's trying to deal with where he is. Have you ever had your emotions just bouncing all over the place from a spiritual standpoint? It seems like sometimes when good things happen to you, that's also when the worst things happen to you, or when you are at your worst afterwards. It doesn't make sense. I think there's nobody that personifies that more than David. He could be up and then boom, smash down and crash. Let's look at John 20, verses 3 and 4.
Peter therefore went forth, and the other disciple, and they were going to the tomb, and the two were running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first.
Okay, two disciples. Again, it's in the book of John, so while we don't know who this other one was, who do we think it probably was? John. And they take off running. Who gets there first? Why? Had longer legs.
He ran faster.
He was younger, he ran faster. You know, again, I'm going to go back. If you're Peter and you love Jesus, you want to go see him. But what was the last thing you did? Do you really want to get there? Yeah, I think his gut is just being ripped apart. And so when he goes, he may not be putting in quite as much steam as John was. And so John gets there first. Peter shows up afterwards to discover the tomb being empty. He was reluctant, and that's just the only way you could word that. Over in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5, it says, he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. So after the resurrection, the first person he appears to is Peter. Wouldn't you have liked to know what they talked about? Now, going back to Stan's point, what did the other disciples do? Yeah, and so he could have been there saying to Peter, thank you for being there. Or he could have been dealing with a major mess up and trying to restore Peter, because at this point he is a crushed man. So he's trying to get him back into a point of leadership. And so he talks with him. We're not told what it is. And that's because it's none of our business. This was between Peter and Jesus. And then after that, what Tom puts in a principle here, and I guess I should cover his principles as well. But he says when correcting or dealing with intimate situations, do so in private, whether it's praising or complimenting. He's going to come back when he wraps up the thing. That's one of the principles he wants us to get across. And I think that's true. Anybody being in management has heard, don't do it publicly, do it privately. And yet, what happens often? A manager does it publicly, humiliates the person, and they never get the respect that they needed. And so there is a truth to that. The next time Peter is with his disciples, it's in the upper room when Jesus appears. We'll pick that up in John 20, verses 19 through 20.
When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, Peace be with you. And when he had said this, he showed them both his hands and his side. The disciples therefore rejoiced when they saw the Lord.
So when Peter is there, Jesus appears, and he gives them this encouragement. What is it? Peace be with you. He wants them to have the peace. That's not easy to do when your body is going through turmoil about what you have done. But he's trying to restore not only him, but now all 12 of the disciples, 11 of the disciples. I don't think they've picked Matthias as their 12th disciple. So they're all being encouraged to have peace. That's something he needed because he absolutely was void of that. His next encounter with Jesus, between Jesus and Peter, is in Galilee. Now, he told him, go ahead, I want you to get to Galilee. So that's the next time Jesus sees them. And let's pick up with that, and that's in John 21, verses 15 through 17.
So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Tend my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Shepherd my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Tend my sheep.
When Jesus was there, how did he refer to Peter? Simon Peter. It says Simon Peter. Does he not?
Before Jesus' words, it says, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me?
The point I was trying to make there, and I guess I either looked at a different version or just got my mind messed up. When you were growing up, if you ever got called by your first and second name, Richard, has that happened to you? I'm hearing some laughter there. You know, you get called out and you know you've done wrong. You know this is being addressed directly to you. And so this is hitting again at his heart. And then what does he ask? And his first response is, well, no, it wasn't just that you love me. Do you love me more than these? And I think what he's referring to there is to the other disciples. That's the first question. And Peter says, yes. What does he do the next time? Jesus asks something else. Do you love me? What does he do a third time? Now, I think there's significance to this. Why would Jesus have asked the question 3 times? Yeah, he denied him 3 times. I think this is driving it home, yet it's also part of his restoration that's taking place. This is an uncomfortable time for Peter, but Peter is now taking back his bold position. Now, Jesus knew these people before he chose them. That includes Judas. He knew them before, and he chose them for these purposes. He chose Peter to be a leader in the church that would follow. But at the same time, he also knew Peter would be bold and stupid, and he would be crushed. And if he was ever going to be that leader, he had to restore him. So, any Marines in here? Okay, so none of us can actually confess this is what takes place. But from everything I understand, they take you and break you and then build you back up so that you are the person they want you to be in the battlefield. In many ways, that's what has taken place with Peter. He has been bold, chosen for that purpose, then crumbled, broken down to nothing, and then restored back so that he can be the leader. So you see that whole progression taking place. It's an amazing and very practical lesson being taught. But Jesus is doing this with him. And so they have the conversation. The conversation are these three things. Now, each time Jesus answers after he says he loves him with a slightly different answer. What was the first one? Tend my lambs. The second time he asks him, he gives him another question, and he says, yes, I love you. And Jesus said, shepherd my sheep. And the third time he does it, he says what? Tend my sheep. You get slight variations on the same thing. But Peter, each time, is being told that he's going to be a shepherd. He's going to be a leader, and he's going to have people underneath him, both probably organizationally as well as spiritually, and he's going to have to shepherd and bring about. And so he has to be pushed into that role. It's a deep, deep dive that he's taking place. I always think it's interesting. What are we talking about in this period of time? What is the big picture? Who's on trial? Who's going to be crucified? It's going to be Jesus. That's where the focus is. Yet in the middle of this tremendous story about our Savior and what he has done for us, there's this little offshoot that deals strictly with Peter. And I think that's a lesson for us, as well as telling us a little bit of God's compassion for how he sets things up. And so we get this little snippet about Peter. Lambs. And what's the difference between a lamb and sheep? Okay, the lamb's the baby. And so these people are going to be coming into this as babies in the faith, and they're going to have to grow up. Who are the sheep? We are. We are. I think I've asked before about people that grew up on a farm. Anybody grow up around sheep? The last couple of days should be a little indicator of this. How do you think, when you picture a little lamb, what do you picture? Oh, come on, folks. Little fleece, little white thing, you're holding it, it smells good, and all this kind of stuff. After they've been out with all this wool, standing out in the rain, and they come back in, how do you think they smell? Like roses. Like roses on a compost heap. They smell terrible. And so, how smart are sheep? Dumb. They'll walk right off a cliff. You have to be out there with them the whole time. They're not very smart. Who is being compared to sheep? folks, we are dumb, we are smelly, we are just, you stop and think about the scriptural basis for who you are, and it's not good. But at the same time, what will the shepherd do for his sheep? And so there's a gospel lesson in there. He is painting this picture so that dumb, smelly sheep can even understand the story. And so he's laying this out, putting it in place for them so that they can understand it better. The next time they're gathered in the upper room, who do you think took charge? Peter. In Acts 1, verse 15, it says, "At this time, Peter stood up among his brothers and sisters, a group of about 120 people who were gathered there. And he said, 'Brothers and sisters, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, when he began to guide them to Jesus, who was arrested.'" Right off the bat, that is when they, I think, replaced Matthias in there. And then on the day of Pentecost, what took place? The Holy Spirit descended and landed on them. Let's look at Acts chapter 2, verses 40 and 41.
And with many other words, he solemnly testified and kept on exhorting them, saying, "Be saved from this perverse generation." So then, those who had received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls.
So you can look at this and you can see this reversal just by the time of Acts in what Peter did, taking on leadership role, preaching, and then the result being people coming to Christ. So there is an opportunity for us, no matter what we have done, to be restored in the eyes of Christ. This was not an easy battle for Peter, but it will lay groundwork for what takes place. And we see that more in the book of Acts and on. Peter has a lot of growing up to do even then. He is Jewish. And how does he feel about eating unclean foods? He's never eaten anything like that. How do you think he felt about circumcision? You had to be circumcised. He's going to walk through these things. He's going to be challenged on them. And being open to the Spirit, he changes his position. And you see this growth. And when we get over into the books of, whenever Tom gets over there, it'll be the year 3035. But you would see the transformation of what takes place in Peter's life. And I kind of hope that we get there too. Unless I live as long as Methuselah, I may not get there, but I made some progress, but then I slept back. But that's the development that he's laying for us. This is just a window, just a snapshot of what Christ has done for Peter and for what he is doing for us. And so we need to keep that in mind and be encouraged that there is hope for us in the midst of all that we go through. Any thoughts or questions or assignments you want to give Mark? You'll be happy to tell him. None? All right, well, with that, we're going to end this a few minutes early. I hope that doesn't bother anybody. But I'm not going to stand up here and just jaw on. So, have a wonderful week.